This is Mike Kamber. I'm the director here at the Bronx Documentary Center. We're a nonprofit here in the South Bronx. And right now we've got an exhibition up on Afghanistan. The show will be up through mid-December, so there's still time to come see it. It's 15 photographers, American, European, Afghan photographers. So some of it's on the wall. There's a lot of multimedia, so come check it out. We're open Thursday through Sunday in the afternoons. And I want to welcome my two guests. They're both old friends and people I've known for many years. Brody is a former U.S. Military photographer. He did 2 tours in Iraq and lived in Afghanistan for 6 years and covered that war as a civilian. And he's now director of photography at the Ground Truth Project. And he's also got an amazing book on Afghanistan, which I have right here. And it's called, is it service member? Is it
attention service member?
Attention service member, yeah. And really a groundbreaking book. Got a lot of attention, and I think you can still get that book, so look for it. We've also got Peter Van Agtmael, who has been working around the world for about 20 years, covered the war in Iraq extensively, and also Afghanistan. Has been in and out for a lot of years, and he's a member of Magnum Photos, which is one of probably the oldest and most prestigious photo agency in the world. And Peter's got a number of books out. Disco Night 9/11 is a great book, and Sorry for the War. Both of those books deal with the war in Afghanistan and the aftermath in the United States. Great books to purchase or come see here at the Bronx Documentary Library, which is open on the weekends, free of charge. So let's get rolling. Ben, I guess we'll lead off with you, and you can, I thought I'd let you guys both kind of present for a few minutes, and then we can backtrack to some specific questions.
Sure, that sounds good. Thanks, Mike, and thanks everybody for being here. Yeah, I thought it was a good sort of opportunity. It's been a couple of months since the fall of Kabul, and like Peter and Mike and I spent so much of our careers photographing these wars, and now the American military is not part of them anymore. Michael, you mentioned my book Attention Service Member, and like my name's the only one on the spine, but it would not have been possible to make so much of that work without my Afghan colleagues. So I thought it was sort of a good opportunity to talk a little bit about like what the fall of Kabul means for journalism in Afghanistan, like what sort of we've been doing and experiencing around that situation. Certainly, maybe some of you have heard, this phrase like the digital Dunkirk. So Dunkirk obviously was like in World War II, and the British civilians helped the British military ferry civilians across the English Channel, and so that term is now used to describe like what a bunch of like military veterans, myself included, tried to do with our Afghan friends and colleagues while the Taliban were taking the city. I think it would be a more apt metaphor if, most of the boats had sunk and there was fog and no one could see anything. We had some successes, and we've had, and some of my friends are still stuck there in difficult situations. But with a little bit of distance, looking back at some of the imagery that we were looking at during that time, I think there's an interesting record to be told about, what is the end of the global war on terror? Like, what does that look like? There are all these sort of competing and almost weaponized images. I guess we should look at some pictures.
Can I just interject? I do want to say, Ben, that I remember clearly I was in New York on 9/11, and I went to Afghanistan. I think a week later I left for Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I remember the whole war on terror, spinning up. I'm a bit older than you guys, though I'm sure you remember it too. And just the enthusiasm for it, just the absolute sort of unabashed you know, it was almost like people were going to a football game or something. It was quite extraordinary, and just to kind of set the stage for where we are 20 years later is, I think, interesting and profound.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember that enthusiasm very well. And that was a big part of my decision to join the military. Not because I shared in that enthusiasm, but because it seemed so crazy. It seemed like something like this. How could this not be the main story of my generation? Like, how should I, like, I couldn't not get involved in some way. And the only sort of tool I knew how to use was photography, but, you know, I didn't have any money or any experience in photography. So I just joined the Army as combat camera, and, you know,
Right.
yeah. Oh, I just see there's a question, if we can physically show the books of the speakers. This is attention service member. Peter, you got your books with you? I might have some.
Here's this is Disco Night, September 11th. There's sort of it's now 5 books that are all sort of interconnected, but the 2 main ones that deal with this era as it relates to the wars. It's a story about America after 9/11, 2 of which are really about the conflicts and the war at home, and its implications on the society. So there's first one is Disco Night, September 11th, and the more recent one is Sorry for the War. This one's still in its shrink wrap, I guess. So those are 2 that, and then there's Second Tour, Hope I Don't Die, which was the first one, but it was published in very small quantities and hard to find. So I kind of tend to not mention that one.
Yeah. And covered the war in Iraq as opposed to Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, it dealt with both. Second Tour, Hope I Don't Die dealt with both, but a lot of the work from that ended up getting folded into Disco Night, September 11th. So I don't really need to talk about both.
Yeah. Ben, do you have a work that you want to share? Or?
Yeah, sure. Let me just share my screen real quick. So this is some of my work from Afghanistan that was in the book. And, you know, coming from the perspective of a soldier, there was never any question in my mind or in many of the soldiers' mind as to, like, was the premise of the war valid and likely to succeed? Everyone said, like, no, that's obviously ridiculous. So I photographed some of the, like, one strategy that I used to sort of talk about that some is like photographing the messaging that the military used. So, you know, some of it was like these motivational posters that they would hang on blast walls without like any trace of irony. And, you know, these kinds of things were everywhere.
And I'm sorry to interject again, just to be clear, you're saying that there was just a tremendous amount of cynicism amongst the American troops, and how far back was this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that went back, I mean, I joined the Army in 2003, so that was pretty early in the war. And I certainly saw it right away with soldiers, you know, particularly like after you had spent time in Iraq or after you'd spent time in Afghanistan. But, you know, in Iraq, I think there was more of a sense that the war was finite. Like there was sort of tasks that once accomplished, you could go home. Whereas in Afghanistan, like this photograph is, you know, taken at the very end of the drawdown, which looks like, you know, any number of photographs that you've seen of, you know, soldiers firing the big artillery gun. But what's really happening here is that the soldiers are going home and they've got to get rid of all these 100-pound 155 shells. And they're too heavy and dangerous and cheap to load onto helicopters or trucks to be brought out. So the soldiers just fired them into the mountains. And a lot of the soldiers pictured here actually were not artillerymen. They were like cooks and mechanics. And this was like a morale building exercise. So everywhere you looked in Afghanistan, there was this, you know, sort of these undercurrents of total absurdity.
Yeah, but you're firing high explosive shells, into somebody's country where they're civilians, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. Soldiers told me they believed the mountains were not inhabited.
Right. Yeah. I imagine if somebody tried to do that in the United States. I
Right.
mean, just
Yeah.
launch massive artillery shells into a woodland area and assume there's nobody there. But anyway,
Right.
continue. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's a huge assumption to make. This is a photograph of an Afghan soldier who's been given this high-tech like bomb finding equipment as the US pulls back. So, the idea is that like he's going to take all this fancy equipment and, dig up all the Taliban bombs. But when I asked him if we could, go out and like find some IEDs together, he said, yeah, sure, meet me at the gate. So, when I met him at the gate, he wasn't wearing any of this stuff. He wasn't even wearing body armor. He just like slung an AK-47 over his shoulder and went out to, where some kid had told him there was a bomb buried. So, sort of photographing the kind of infrastructure of the war in a very straightforward way, I found sort of a revealing strategy to talk about, the dissonance between the like military effort and its like actual results on the ground.
Did you, Ben, just to be clear, in your opinion, did you feel that dissonance or that absurdity or lack of effectiveness was headed up by the U.S. military, or was it government policy, or was it the partnership with the Afghan government, or how would you pinpoint that?
I mean, the premise of remaking Afghanistan and the United States is like military, judicial, economic, social mold is an absurd premise. So, the military, was there to achieve political ends, which isn't like what our military is actually that good at. So, lieutenants came up with they sort of found the command intent and did their best to execute on that. But what it really looked like was, these soldiers have been cooped up in this base for almost a year. They're obviously like lifting weights and, this guy was abusing steroids for sure. He's actually not with us anymore. He OD'd last year. You would find them like goofing off in the base while the Afghan military was getting completely wrecked, like right outside their walls. So it is important to remember that like the, big military operations, the stuff that, looks like this, the stuff that looks like this, and this, this all ended by 2014. So this isn't something that just stopped like last year and then the Afghan military collapsed. Like all the Joes patrolling out in the fields and like running little combat outposts, that's been gone since, it's really been gone since 13. Yeah. So that's definitely something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you look at the kind of imagery, this is just like a folder from my WhatsApp around the HKIA evacuation. It's just so chaotic and, people sharing memes with each other. Like this is the Taliban, dressed up like Navy SEALs basically. So people are, making jokes about it. This is the Taliban's own propaganda. Obviously like looking at, the photograph from World War II, planting the flag on the hill. They made one themselves. And, these are photographs that like my colleagues took from either inside the airport or in the aftermath of the bombing. Oh, this was Marcus Yams. Or, pictures of like the situation they were trying to get through, showing me where they were so I could help navigate them through these like military maps that I had access to and we're being updated in real time with
So
telephone.
you were trying to talk them through the streets to get them to a place where they could actually get into the airport and get evacuated.
Yeah, exactly. So I was in contact with people inside the airport, and there were rapidly shifting directives, whether you go to Eastgate, which is here, or Northgate, which is up here. Like that was where our first attempts were on the Northgate. But you know, these like almost oceanic crowds were making it impossible for my colleagues who had families with them to get through. So, you know, we were doing our best to find like the easiest, the most likely point of entry. But the fact is almost no one I was working with was able to get through if they had their families with them, like if they had kids with them. Yeah, there were some, like my friend, an Afghan photographer who's young and strong and by himself, like he was able to get through the North Gate on his own.
Right, but certainly not with children in tow.
Definitely not.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's like we think about our responsibilities as journalists for, you know, the people we work with, the people we've been friends with. Some of the people who did get out are like stuck in Qatar right now in a really hard situation. You know, I've heard some people say like they regret leaving Afghanistan because like now they're in a refugee camp in Qatar and they can't get out, and their loved ones, you know, got left behind. They got separated at the airport.
Is there a path for them to get to the United States? Do you know, or what's happening with that?
It's unclear. So my colleagues, I have submitted what's called P2 visa requests for them. That paperwork is ongoing. They should be able to like qualify for a P2 in theory, but there's a finite number of P2s and there are tens of thousands of applications in. So whether or not like that process will come to anything, we won't even have any clue about that for another 2 or 3 years, which is how long the backlog is right now.
So does that mean they're going to be stuck in a refugee camp in the meantime?
Yeah.
That's brutal.
Yeah.
Absolutely brutal. Yeah, that's amazing. From a military point of view, what is your take on the American withdrawal and how it was executed?
Yeah, it's I don't know how it could have gone down any other way. You know, I know there are a lot of military personnel talking about how like, well, if we had only kept Bagram Airfield, you know, this would have been orderly. And, you know, maybe it's true that the optics wouldn't have been as terrible. And if they had held on to Bagram, then they wouldn't have been in such an incredible position of weakness in front of the Taliban. Like, you know, the Taliban could have overrun the airport at any time if they wanted, but, you know, it's just in their interest to let the Americans go and see their backs in an orderly fashion.
Did you expect the country to fall so quickly for the ANA, for the Afghan army to dissipate and negotiate and make deals?
No, not at all. And yeah, I was kind of surprised at myself for not expecting that. You know, I mean, I had witnessed like the bravery of the Afghan forces on many times. Like Afghan soldiers have saved my life on more than one occasion. You know, I've been around plenty of Afghan military personnel who are, you know, courageous and smart and take the initiative. So yeah, I mean, I definitely did not see the military falling that fast. I don't know. Did you?
Myself personally, no. I mean, I think I kind of was reading the experts and assuming that, I mean, I think after the Soviets pulled out, they hung on for a couple of years, you know, and I kind of thought that, you know, the other thing, I think I said this last time I was talking to Victor Blue, we did an event and, you know, I went to Afghanistan and I remember going out on patrol with these Marines and they were doing this training program with the Afghan military. And they said, you know, we have a new plan. We're going to get the Afghans up to speed and they're going to take over, you know, and then I'd go back a couple of years later and they'd say, we've got a new plan. We're going to get the Afghans up to speed. And they would keep telling me the same thing, like this was a new plan. It was quite extraordinary. It was like, I mean, this had been the plan for, 15, 18 years or something. But there was like this
Right.
idea at some point that they were going to spend enough money. And I think they spent billions of dollars training the Afghan military, but a lot of the money never got down to the troops. Some of the troops were going hungry, running out of bullets, et cetera. So, I think a lot of that money went to American contractors, as I understand. So.
Oh yeah. No, there was a tremendous amount of corruption and graft for sure. But the US military had the same sort of issue in Vietnam. Like, so I was in the army like at the height of the Iraq war. The longest tour I did was 15 months, and that was like a monster. But you can definitely say that like the military fought like 20 like 1 year long wars, rather than like 1 20-year war. I mean, there was so little continuity. Even when I would like really piss the military off with my like reporting from Afghanistan, the next fighting season it would be a new unit, and there was no like institutional memory of like working with me. So they'd be like, oh yeah, oh my gosh, your former military, come along with us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it worked to my advantage.
Right. And so much of effective counterinsurgency is relationships and, creating relationships in communities. That takes years and years. When you're swapping people out, I think the Marines were on 7-month tours or 9-month tours.
Yep.
Not to belittle them at all, but it's hard when you're constantly rotating in new people and new commanders. It's hard to have that continuity.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we'll talk more about that. Yeah. Do you have other things you want to get to now, or should we switch to Peter?
Sure. I'd love to hear Peter's take on all this. You had a really interesting perspective for sure.
Yeah. Peter, you were in Afghanistan, or you were in Iraq pretty early, and then you transitioned into Afghanistan, or moved into Afghanistan a bit later. Is that correct?
Yeah, I started working in Iraq in beginning of 2006, and then Afghanistan in 2007. And I kind of for some years bounced back and forth between the two, and then had some years where I was looking more kind of at the US and both the implications of the war on the society here, but also more broadly speaking, kind of what it was about this country that could create an ideology that let us so kind of casually go into war. So it was partly about history, and it was partly about kind of culture, partly about character, really. And then kind of when ISIS took over, I started spending quite a bit of time in Iraq again in that phase until kind of the fall of ISIS and the Battle of Mosul. So this has now been really 15 years of kind of peeling back the onion of this country and its constant and the consequences of 9/11, both on the world and kind of on ourselves. And to tell a story about the last 20 years, you need to rigorously document what's happening in the here and now, but you also really have to, I think, rigorously document the imprint of that history on the present as well. I mean, no story about the present is possible without a story about the past, and the ghosts of the past are visible everywhere. And I can show some pictures too. I mean, it's kind of a limited selection of, I suppose, some of my own work. And then with Ben, we're sort of just starting this process, he and I together, of putting together kind of a work about the fall of Kabul and the final days of the American presence in Afghanistan, kind of collecting all this different ephemera from our individual and kind of shared experiences in that period. So I'll show a little bit of that as well. Should I share my screen and just walk through a few things here?
That'd be great. We'd love that.
Is that the way to go? Okay, here we go. See my screen? We got my screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll just, I'll just go through some of these pictures. This is a picture. This is taken in the eastern part of Afghanistan, and the helicopter I'm on and kind of leaning out of as it comes to land. Basically, every soldier on that helicopter I was on ended up being killed or wounded in the deployment that followed. They were arriving on. This was day one on their arrival, and the guys on the ground are about to be pulled out. And I start with this picture a little bit because it, what happened on this base sort of symbolized a lot of what to me is the U.S. experience in Afghanistan. I got to this sort of mountaintop where, as far as you could see, were sort of 10, 12,000 kind of foot peaks in the Hindu Kush Mountains, right bordering the Pakistan border. And there were about 45 U.S. soldiers there. And I was talking to the lieutenant who was in charge of this platoon, who was sort of one of the more sort of thoughtful and impressive kind of junior officers I met in my time there, who really kind of understood what they were up against. And I remember asking him, well, what's your area of operations? And he said, well, kind of as far as the eye can see. And he said, well, and I said, so, well, how do you do an effective job kind of keeping weapons and personnel kind of from funneling in from Afghanistan? He's like, well, we don't really do that. That's impossible. We're all on foot and we can barely get up and down this mountain, much less all the other ones. And he's like, so we make a deal. So essentially, I made a series of deals with the village elders to provide resources in exchange for stability. And I was like, well, did it work? He's like, yeah, it worked. And it's like, do you think it'll continue to work? It's like, no, it's a fair weather deal. It's like, as long as there's something for them, it'll probably work, unless they get a better deal from the Haqqani network, which were the insurgents in that area, or if the unit that follows mine adopts a different policy. And I said, well, so in the meantime, then what happens with the guys that aren't going through your valley? And he said, well, they're just going through the next valley. It's like, well, then, so does that mean you'll move to the next valley? It's like, yeah, at which point they'll just move back to this valley. And so that to me became this kind of metaphor for the whole war. It was like, you had a dike bursting into a bunch of seams with the water pouring through it, and you only had a few fingers to place in it. And so it was all done in this kind of official largesse and PowerPoint presentations and strategic maps. But in the end, the core guiding premise was pretty, absurd and superficial at best.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of scenes in Tim Hetherington's movie Restrepo where you're looking out over these mountains. It's just, valley after valley after valley. And there's, 100 guys responsible for miles and miles of the most rugged, difficult terrain in the world. They couldn't patrol 1% of it. Quite extraordinary.
Yeah. And that particular unit, unlike the unit I was with, saw kind of fighting as the primary solution,
right,
which of course led nowhere.
Right.
Led to a lot of death, not much farther. And this is down in Helmand province. The pictures, a lot of the pictures I take, they tend to be kind of, I try and process my feelings when I'm doing these things, both during the fact and after it, and think, well, what is it I'm feeling, and how do I make a picture of it? And a lot of that was this sort of disconnect really between the Afghans and the Marines. This in particular was a conversation about an upcoming election, and the Marines were asking if the Afghans would vote, and they said no, they wouldn't vote, because if they voted, they would have their fingers kind of stained purple, so they didn't vote again. But if the Taliban saw a finger stained purple, they'd cut off the fingers. So no one wanted to vote. And there are times that, both the pictures and the experience kind of, felt like a metaphor for other wars. This was a moment it reminded me of Vietnam, and in many ways the conflict itself, an unwinnable insurgency, seemed to be an echo of Vietnam. And throughout the experience there was this kind of, I generally had this feeling of confusion of this sort of massive machine in motion in regards to bureaucracy and the government of the US, when the facts kind of at ground level seemed entirely in opposition to any eventual success.
Mhm.
but there's that just that ongoing. There's the momentum, the boulder running down the hill.
Right. Do you, Peter, just not to pull you away too much, but do you have favorite books from Vietnam, or either photo books or written books that you recommend? Because I'm always struck when I read Vietnam history how similar it was, particularly to Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, photographically, Vietnam Inc. by Philip Jones Griffith is kind of the classic. People love I love Dispatches by Michael Herr. Everybody loves that book. Really underrated book, I would say, is called Bloods. It's an oral history of the Black experience in Vietnam. Was quite popular when it came out, but kind of has fallen by the wayside a little bit. It's really one of the most damning and effective portraits of both the absurdity of the war and kind of the way kind of race and society and history kind of translated into the U.S. military in that context as well. So that's kind of a unmissable book. Fire in the Lake is a very good one too.
Yeah, but these books that talk about like unwinnable wars, I mean, they go back. I mean, Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness is, that's like an unwinnable war. That's like an absurd military approach. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the list goes on, but those are some of the key texts. Larry Burroughs' Vietnam coverage. Henry Hewitt, highly underrated AP photographer, killed in Vietnam. Burroughs also killed in Vietnam, unfortunately, but Hewitt, I think, was one of the great kind of poets and documentarians. Hasn't quite gotten his due.
Yeah, maybe the greatest, and very unknown.
Yeah. Speaking of Tim, this is that same unit that he was with, and this on their first day is this was a guy being treated after getting shot in the chest during an ambush, and in the background you see kind of a blanket, and it's a blanket covering a body, and it's a soldier by the name of Timothy Vimoto, and he was killed in the same ambush that wounded this other soldier. And this young soldier Vimoto, he was age 19, and he was the son of the top ranking enlisted man in the same unit. And the father and son had deployed to Afghanistan together. And the son then was killed on one of his first patrols.
Was this 173rd Airborne?
This is 173rd Airborne. Yeah, you can see the patch there in the background.
Mm-hmm. And was Lindsay there that day as well? No,
that was before Tim and Lindsay got there. So they got there, I think, a few months later in Balaj. They got there a few months later.
Right.
Sebastian was around. I remember I ran into Sebastian at some point along the way.
Yeah. And you always include a lot of photos that are very untypical war photos in your work. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it wasn't a conscious decision necessarily. I mean, my feeling about, I was interested in covering conflict, but I never really related solely to war photography. And the way I've always looked at photography is always been trying to extract things from every single conceivable form of photography as it relates to the ultimate goal of expressing, at times a thoughtful story, at times a beautiful story, at times a brutal story, a contradictory story, overall as complex a story as possible. And I think the more you can kind of absorb different kinds of visual languages and to kind of unfold that into one's own thoughts and feelings and identity, the more you can tell the easier you can tell a good story. And so the canon of any of these genres of photography I've never really wanted to be kind of limited by them.
Right. But there's I find in your photos, I hope you don't take this wrong, but I find in your photos a very, very strong air of unreality. They feel, sometimes they feel like film stills. If you showed a photo a little bit earlier where there was a guy was looking at the 9/11 towers exploding, and there were some of these things look like they were, I realize that you photographed them in real time and you never posed anything, but they look like surreal pieces from a dream or something, you know. I find something very, yeah, I don't know how to describe it, but there's an air of unreality to your photos from Afghanistan, I find.
Well, I suppose that's a good thing. I mean, it's my experience of it and recollections of it is this feeling of surreality and unreality. I mean, that a country like the U.S. with all its kind of accomplishments and brain power and thoughtfulness in many ways could so violently lurch and maintain such an insane, brutal situation at the time struck me as deeply surreal and unexpected. You know, I was also a much younger man and less kind of knowledgeable about the history and of the country, and sort of insulated from a lot of that history by circumstance of race and class and upbringing and the kind of information that, you know, was taught to me. You know, obviously all that changes and shifts over time, and now you'd have to be, you know, a bit of a fool to not have your eyes wide open about all the violent hypocrisies and dangers of this, you know, of this great but unbelievably troubled nation.
Yeah, I also find how it's interesting how later on you combine, you know, photos of American arms gun shows and, you know, the whole variety of things. But did you have issues? Did you have issues getting access photographing American casualties? I mean, I obviously ran into a lot of problems in my years there. Did you have trouble photographing coffins and casualties?
I didn't, but I also got in before the sort of broad-based bans came in.
Right.
So I did the majority of that work from kind of 2006 to 2010.
Right.
And then the sort of ground rules for journalists changed, and they
Right.
became this kind of Kafkaesque labyrinth that was impossible to navigate, where essentially, right, you'd have to go to a unit with a bunch of forms saying, "Hey, buddy, if you get shot and killed, you know, this is just a waiver to make sure it's cool for me to take a picture." Like, you know, who's gonna do that? You know, it's insane. It's impossible. So, and I know you ran into that. You ran into that also partly because your pictures were, you know, on the front page of the New York Times, and, you know, early on when I was photographing a lot of that stuff, no one was publishing my work. And certainly no one was publishing my pictures of casualties. And if they were publishing them in Europe and not the US. I just didn't have the backing of any major institutions at that point. So I was anonymous, and people were indifferent to it, you know. So I can't tell you the number of times that, you know, I sent those pictures to the New York Times and Newsweek and Time and the Post and everybody, and you know, no one published it.
Did either of you find yourselves like sort of self-censoring and just not taking pictures that you knew you couldn't sell, or, you know, couldn't be published, or would mess up your embed status?
I didn't know enough to not take those pictures.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
I was 24 when I started doing this, and I didn't understand how the game was played. I was just looking at all the Vietnam stuff and being like, well, that's my inspiration, so I should kind of be following in that tradition, I suppose. You know, I didn't understand the politics of the media at all at the time. It was kind of nice.
My policy was always to take the photos and then work it out later, you know, and try to figure out what would happen with those photos later on. But I did send some fairly gruesome photos to the New York Times of American casualties, and not only did they not publish them, but they put them in some type of digital vault so that nobody could see them. I believe they're still there.
Yeah, I believe it. I remember seeing, especially there's that ambush you photographed in Iraq, and I wondered all the pictures I wasn't seeing.
Right.
And I think this is the case too. I mean, if I think of, you know, I put some really brutal pictures in my books, but those pictures have never been published in newspapers or magazines, certainly.
Right.
And if I think of also, you know, because this circle of kind of conflict photographer types or what have you is relatively small. I've seen tons of pictures by friends and colleagues that are extremely devastating that
Right.
have never seen the light of day.
Yeah. Exactly.
Sorry, I've kind of fucked up there. I better keep moving because I know time is getting on.
I'm distracting you. Sorry.
It's all good. It's more interesting to have a conversation anyhow. So I showed some pictures in the war at home, pictures from movie sets like this one. I started even doing film stills from movies themselves, the heroic narrative of the war in film that kind of was in stark contrast to what I was seeing myself and experiencing myself. Hollywood, for all its so-called liberal values, ultimately wanting to create things that sold, that people would go see. So now I'm just going to get in. This is just very fragmented and very rough, so bear with me. These are some of the images, this stuff I've been collecting and Ben has been collecting, trying to create a look at the fall of Afghanistan from all these different kind of perspectives of both people that were there, people that got out, people that didn't, the way it was being seen from the outside, the way we were seeing it. It's going to be a complex thing to put together, but it should be interesting. So this was early in that phase, and I was looking at sort of New York Times headlines versus Fox News headlines. The contrast and the way that the different medias and the different narratives are being told. So that was one thing that was sort of interesting me. I did a bunch of those. I'll just show small versions of it. Man, then, because I wasn't there myself, I was going through obsessively. I was on vacation at the time, so that wasn't maybe the best way to have a vacation, but I was kind of obsessively going through all these different videos that were being posted on Twitter, Instagram, and kind of creating my own narrative of what was happening through screen grabs, through stills of videos I was watching. And then I was contrasting that with what the Department of Defense was putting out and the Marines on their official digital channels, pictures like this. And back to another screen grab. Then I started looking at what people were posting kind of about the early phases of the war, and things that they were posting, memories and musings. So this was, I thought, an interesting one. Oops, where's my mouse? See, shit, I can't. Well, I hope you guys can read that because I can't read it because I can't find my mouse to move the little faces away from the text.
We can read it. We can read it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And another one, a Tom Friedman article. I think inherent in all the kind of societal criticisms I do, you always have to look in the mirror at the institution you represent. And for me, I suppose I most closely represent the media, even if I don't really feel a part of anything.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to see some of this stuff because I think like for us, maybe the apt comparison with Dunkirk is like the movie where it shows the like people's perspective in this like very narrow field and nobody can see what the other person is seeing. Like I never got to see any of this stuff because I was just working on my WhatsApp chats.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, the people I'd worked with in Afghanistan were already taken care of. So I didn't really have anyone to help. So I was doing this deep dive into the dark corners of the internet and getting increasingly agitated that I wasn't there because it was this sort of end of these wars and in some ways the symbolic end of a lot of the work I'd been doing. So then I made this kind of desperate cockamamie attempt to get in to Afghanistan through, I'm not going to tell the whole story because it's a really long story, but essentially through this ex-special forces guy I know who partnered with a kind of an organization that had chartered a plane through kind of somewhat shady Department of Defense or maybe CIA contacts. And he was able to get in to Afghanistan to try and pull out the family members of some of these ex-Afghan commandos. And I was talking to him because he's a buddy of mine, and he's like, look, I can get you a seat on one of the flights. So I flew out to Bahrain to get on and arrived in Bahrain 24 hours later. The whole plan kind of fell apart. It's a long story. I'm not going to get into it, but this was so some of it is just the text message exchange there, text messages, whatever, with my mom and dad, who were extremely relieved that I wasn't able to make it in. They were very upset when I was trying to go in. a meal that the sort of meal I had at the hotel after 22 hours of travel and this deep disappointment. Anyhow, the point of this isn't to make a story about myself so much as just present one of these strange simultaneous narratives of what's going on. Part of what we want to do is kind of create this timeline of all these weird events going on. Meanwhile, back to the Department of Defense Instagram, it's Happy National Dog Day to say, as Kabul is falling. And then because I couldn't get in, I was talking a lot with Jericho, my ex-special ops guy who had gotten in. And when he got back, I was asking him just to take lots of pictures and video. And anyhow, he was doing it for himself regardless. And he and I had met on a film set originally, and he's kind of keenly interested in photography. So I thought, well, if I can't be there, then I can, and he's on the ground, I can translate his footage into pictures. So he was taking all these videos, and I made, again, still images out of the videos. When he got back from there, he gave me everything he had. So I started doing screen grabs of video that I thought was made for powerful pictures.
Great.
This is all the scene kind of at Abbey Gate.
Yeah, Abbey is where most of our attempts were. But we pulled back the day before it was bombed.
You could see the chaos, and I didn't get in through the unofficial channels. I didn't get in through official channels, despite having kind of fairly high-level military officers advocating for me. So, I mean, they really tried to. But this was the absurdity of it. At some point, when I was fed up, I just sent an email to the Pentagon spokesman, being like, the cat is out of the bag. Everyone knows what's going on. You can't keep the information of it out. Don't you at least want some responsible members of the media kind of documenting it, to which I received no response. So these were Jericho's pictures, or my interpretation of Jericho's video. Again, meanwhile, this is what's being posted. This is what the military is trying to externalize.
It was quite an extraordinary propaganda effort by the U.S. military.
Yeah, but it was totally flubbed because there was too much information coming out. Everyone's got a camera on their cell phone, so can't keep this information at bay.
Right.
So I flew to Bahrain. Wasn't able to get into Kabul. Flew all the way back to Texas, and the next day to do a story about what at that point had been the last KIA in Afghanistan. A guy named went by the name Jaguar. Which was his nickname, Gutierrez. And I arrived to the news of the explosion outside Kabul, Abbey Gate. And so in many ways, I kind of dodged a bullet by not being at the place where the explosion happened. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, again, the dissonant kind of news. New York Times is somewhat more straight account, Fox News, mm-hmm. With their usual kind of coded language.
Right.
And then images, sorry, I should have trigger warning, but then I had to do a deep dive for sort of images of the same place, Abbey Gate, and the casualties outside Abbey Gate. It's a lot more than this. This was trying to not ruin people's Friday night too much, but
yeah,
some pretty devastating footage.
Brutal.
And then
this
and
picture,
we focus on the 12 Americans, but do you know how many Afghans were killed?
Hundreds, which is why I wanted to show these sort of surreal pixelated images. These are the Afghans. The bodies filled in the canal.
Yeah. They're not even mentioned in the Fox News headline.
Oh no, heavens no.
Yeah. I mean,
Afghans have never been really real people to us throughout this.
Ben, I'm sorry, you said something?
Yeah, I mean, I think 172 is what I heard.
Yeah.
So I'll do a few more here in the last few. Biden breaks vow and leaves stranded Americans in the hands of bloodthirsty Taliban. Washington Post, Biden declares Afghanistan withdrawal a success. And then these are some last images just of the family, somehow with all these screen grabs. Normally I'm a pretty sharp, straight shooter, but somehow with all the blurry images I was taking, I started doing blurry almost images of the family. This was Jaguar's father, somehow on the day of the suicide bombing. The room turned into a shrine to their son. A dog tag made of Jaguar's face.
You said they're in the Southwest somewhere?
They're in the South. They're in San Antonio, Texas. His mother,
How old was he?
I believe he was 28, I believe. I'll talk, and then some objects from his life, just the little remnants that they kept in this room. His autopsy report, letters from boot camp.
Why did you want to photograph
The lock of his hair. What's that?
Why did you want to photograph the last soldier killed?
It was an assignment, and it was an assignment that I was en route to when the reporter and I decided to kind of pivot to try and go to Afghanistan. So he and I went there together. And then when it became clear we weren't going to be able to get in, we thought we could at least finish the story that we started. And so we flew back, and you know, it seems surreal in some ways at a moment at the end of this war to tell a story just about American soldiers, when really the Afghans are the ones, soldiers and civilians are the ones that bore the true cost of these wars.
Right.
But this also became exercise in what, you know, what was possible to get into print.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but like, how do you communicate?
I'll take whatever I can get sometimes, you know. I've hardly been able to pitch a successful story about these conflicts for years. So, you know, take what you can get.
You of all people have focused on doing things that were, you know, as representative as possible. And what do you think the Afghans are up against at this point? And is there anything that we can do here from this side?
Give money to humanitarian aid organizations to stave off mass starvation.
Keep pressure on the State Department to process these visas.
Right. Yeah, it shouldn't take 3 years to process a visa for somebody who worked for an American organization.
Yeah.
Completely bonkers. Yeah.
Yeah, but it'll be long. I don't, you know, I haven't been back since then. You know, I'll hopefully go at some point in the coming months. So I don't have a ground eye perspective on where the need is, and it is always difficult to separate, you know, one's own interpretation of events from this massive noise, and propaganda coming from, you know, every direction.
Are either of you in touch with Afghan photographers or journalists over there? And what have you heard?
Yeah, I am. I mean, the folks that I'm in touch with are all basically laying low. You know, food insecurity is a big issue. Taliban, like, or ISIS assassinating people who sort of stick their heads out is definitely an increasing issue, even in places that were formerly called like pretty safe, like in the north, like in Mazar-e Sharif. Right. You know, the idea of Islamic State assassination in Mazar-e Sharif a year ago, like that would be nuts. But that absolutely happened last week to my close colleague's neighbor.
Right.
She's a women's rights activist.
Right. Extraordinary and terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, the question remains, like, how do you communicate about this stuff to a Western audience in a way that like helps them understand, gets their attention? You know, I think like Peter and I are like often talking about our own experiences. Like, I mean, I wrote the text on attention service members from the first person perspective, not because like I think my life is, you know, out of the ordinary or, you know, of any consequence, but just as a strategy to like bring somebody into this story. It's like, you know, the war may seem like really exotic and far away, but like you can get to know me. I'm just some guy. Yeah.
Yeah, but it also becomes critical to personalize these stories from an Afghan point of view. And really, I think if we can connect people with what individual Afghans, you know, it's very hard to connect with, you know, 35 million people, but if we can create individual stories with individual Afghans, I think we can make Americans continue to care about it, or at least I hope so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Well, this is, you know, and it's a, you know, it's a big battle within all these structures too. I mean, this is, you know, in the last year, there was a real reckoning with, representation within the media of photographers and photographers' voices and who gets to tell whose story, and that extended in this, that's extended now in this country, in regards to gender to some degree, it's in regards to race to some degree, partly domestically, maybe somewhat less internationally, but it's just the tip of the iceberg in kind of telling, thoughtful and broad stories. And there is a total absurdity to people like Ben and my kind of the weight of our kind of experience, because we're able to translate it into books, becoming kind of a stronger part of the institutional memory than is perhaps fair and reasonable given our extremely small part in telling a complex narrative about the place. I mean, this is the reason for me why I have been teaching for many years in this program called the Arab Documentary Photography Program, and two of my former students are Magnum nominees. It's like, you have to, and why you do the Bronx Documentary Center, and why Ben does Report for America and the Ground Truth Project. You don't have to, you can't just talk about this stuff. You gotta do it. You have to realize, the humbling nature of one's experience in the field is goes to show like how limited you are. Just, your work, your brain, your experience, and the necessity in trying to push out thoughtful voices in as many ways, in any way you can.
Yeah, we're a fraction of 1%. Yeah, we're so insignificant, but we, for better for worse, we have some access to amplify our voices through certain channels. So I think we're trying to do it as best we can. If there are questions, if you can, folks, if you're out there and you want to ask some questions, now's a great time to do it. We'd love to, at 7:00, we'd love to take a few questions.
Yeah, we did that kind of more or less on time. That was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you, a question to you both quickly, could, I mean, again, I don't want to open up a can of worms, but could it have gone differently? Could this whole 20-year experiment have come down differently? Was there, I always say, I think a lot of people feel like there were lots of other easy answers. I feel like there were no easy answers, but was there something else that could have worked?
So I'll tell an anecdote real quick. I was just down doing working on another book, of which, as maybe unsurprisingly, there is a military component, quite a small military component, but one nonetheless. And I was I met, I would say, kind of two super impressive junior officers in my time embedding. One got out of the Army because of he thought he was up against forces that were well beyond his control and that they weren't going to alter, and that he was just going to be, it was a Sisyphean task kind of thing. And the other took the same kind of stimuli and made a different decision. And now he's a colonel. He's got a brigade under his command. I met him when he was a captain, and I was asking this very question the other day, and he's just like, "Yeah, get out in 2002, and not go through this absurd exercise that we were never fully committed to of so-called kind of nation building and democracy building when we didn't give the tools to people, and the military never had the tools to begin with. The military is not designed, as Ben can speak to, for nation building, democracy building. I mean, it's designed for killing.
Yeah.
Right. Like the invasion of Iraq, like that's what the military is made for.
Right.
Everything that happened after that. Yeah.
There's a great.
But I mean, I worked on a project in Afghanistan in 2015. So like the military was mostly gone. But I was photographing like the Afghan millennial generation, people who are entrepreneurs and political leaders in this generation. And, it was sort of the argument I was making with this coverage is that like, well, look what the NATO presence in Afghanistan like made possible. Like, look what the fall of the Taliban made possible. Like all this, like educated young people, like girls' schools, like, And there were like these incredibly inspiring stories, just basic like medical facilities and food security were getting better. So it's like, you can make this simultaneous argument that like the military occupation in Afghanistan like achieved a lot of good things. And you can make the same argument that the military occupation in Afghanistan was completely absurd and was like doomed to fail. And they're both true.
Right.
People always, you always get it as like a war photographer or whatever, what's the real truth? Like what's really happening? It's like, there's nothing true. Like,
Yeah.
Well, this is an era, every era is one of everyone kind of makes their own truth.
Mhm.
Yeah. Though I do, as skeptical as I've been, I do think there's probably great value in, especially women having had, 20 years to make some real achievements and move forward and get a foothold. And hopefully in the future, they'll be able to build on that. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't look like it right now, but time will tell. But I think there's, probably 15 million women in Afghanistan that who some of whom have had another chance thanks to it. But that's not necessarily a validation for, 20 years of war. But, one of the I read a thing about Vietnam, and they said, the Americans do what the Americans know how to do. So in Vietnam, they built massive bases. They just built and built and built and built. And I thought about that vis-a-vis Afghanistan, where it was really, we can't win the war militarily or politically, but we can spend money, and we just spent massive amounts of money thinking that was going to turn the tide, just billions and billions of dollars, thinking that would lead to a solution. It looks like we have a question from Josue or Josue. How do you handle trauma after these coverages? What is the advice for high stress and trauma situations during coverage?
I don't know. I'm not really a good like spokesman for wellness. I don't know. What do you do, Peter?
You're a pretty balanced dude. I don't know. I mean, I went to therapy. And I still do. That helped. And I, at some point, extricated myself from doing frontline coverage by and large. I still, once in a while, if it's important, I'll take the risk, like trying to get into Afghanistan. I've been covering Israel-Palestine for years. I've been in, wars in Gaza. If it's super, super, super important to me, I'll do it. But if it's not, then I won't, and just because it stunts your emotional growth at a certain point to be going down that rabbit hole. And some people went down the rabbit hole and never came out. And maybe the perk of living in New York and having an intergenerational relationship between photographers is you realize that, there's some cautionary tales out there. So, it's not perfect because you're altered forever by these experiences. Is it worth the cost? Maybe. It's hard to say. Who knows what our lives would have looked like if we hadn't made these choices? But
I think
we are.
I think the three of us sitting here are the lucky ones. And, I know people that went out on their first combat patrol and were killed. I think Giles Dooley went out in his first combat patrol and lost 2 legs and an arm. My friend Tim Haddon was dead. Most of us have lost very close friends. So just be real with the younger photographers. If anybody's watching this, it's a crapshoot. Not about your smarts or your ability. It's all luck. And we've been very lucky.
Been very lucky. Yeah, that's all there is to it. Super skilled people died, super experienced. Chris. I mean, we know, unfortunately, we all have a long list of people we know or we're friends with or acquaintances with who are dead or badly injured. Joao, still remember well with Mike, when Joao lost his legs and was at Walter Reed, and he'd come up here periodically to get a break, and going around with him and seeing how strong he was, but also how much pain he was in. And, it was hard.
Yeah. Dozens of operations. Horrible. Yeah.
But, I'm sure you both get these emails, that come into me every, couple of months from somebody who wants to be a conflict photographer, and, how do they get started? And they just want to photograph war. And I mean, it's like photographing war for war's sake is like a short road to getting really messed up. Having like something having a specific idea about what you want to do. It's like, Peter, what you were saying about like only going if it's something that's really important to you. I mean, that definitely factors into my calculus of risk as well. And I think, you know, it keeps me a little bit sane.
Yeah. And
Or
it
at
only
least
happens
deliberate.
also because we got lucky too. I mean, I started going to stuff at a certain point just because it was there. And one time when I nearly got killed, I started reevaluating that, you know, and I could have been killed, but I wasn't. So I got lucky, and it allowed me to make those choices, but it could have easily gone another way.
Yeah.
Right.
I'd go on embeds and they'd want me to go out on multiple patrols, you know, all day long, just out on patrol. You're just basically making yourself a target. Quickly, I want to wrap up, but quickly, just to come back to the US for a little bit, what do you think the effect of the Afghanistan war has been on the home front? You know, you spoke, Ben, about a friend of yours who died of an OD, but you know, basically on a micro level, on a macro level, do you think that it has changed the way Americans feel about America, or do you think it's had a real effect on the military generation that came out of Afghanistan? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's had a huge, the GWAT, the Global War on Terror, you know, as these sort of wars were bundled by the Pentagon, had a huge effect on policing in America. This sort of idea that the police officer is a warrior first, that they have like rules of engagement that are like, you know, a soldier on patrol in Baghdad during the height of the war. Like, I mean, that is something I can draw a line really easily to in terms of like the cultural impact. And of course, you know, police, you know,
surplus military hardware. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the militarization of the police has huge consequences for, you know, American society and the sort of civil contracts that we like live under. Yeah, I mean and of course, like on the micro level, it's you know, there are so many veterans who are no longer with us, or who you know, have serious struggles. But it's much broader than just the people who went.
Right.
You know, and you know, just the legacy of like the avalanche of lies and bullshit that came out of like Iraq and Afghanistan, as just normalizing the government like lying to the American people in such a like brash and brazen way, has also obviously had consequences for our political system.
Right. Yeah.
And beyond that, if I think of, you know, even taking it one circle outward into like, how do these wars get remembered, and what lessons do we then extract from them for future generations? Because it's not like military funding is going down at all. You have this vast military that gobbles up an enormous amount of our national budget. And, you know, we have a society that doesn't seem to have interpreted lessons from this military in a way, or from these experiences in a way that might prevent them in the future. And that's what my concern is. You know, being down at this training exercise in a base last week, talking to the young soldiers there, a lot of whom weren't even born when these wars started, they're just itching. They're just itching for a fight. You know, a lot of them were just itching for a fight. And it was sort of staggering to me, you know, because it's like, damn, like you've grown up your whole life observing these sort of the insanity of these conflicts and their inglorious ends, and it hasn't altered your ideology one bit. And so I do fear for the future, because, you know, as I was kind of showing you with these different, you know, New York Times, Fox News, whatever the different narratives, you know, there are so many simultaneous narratives in this country, and most of them don't talk about these conflicts the way we are on this panel. And hell, there aren't many people attending it, and there are not many people attending it for a reason. It's like it's an unpopular way to think about who we are as a nation, you know, as violent and brutal and thoughtless and sort of so sucked in by our own momentum that we cause a massive tragedy to ourselves, to the Afghans, to the Iraqis, almost unthinkingly, and then extract no lessons from it at the end, you know. And I'm maybe exaggerating a bit for effect, but, you know, I see, unfortunately, the validation of that opinion everywhere. It's not the one I wanted to have. but it's the one I hold.
Yeah, I think, man, I'm not sure how to deal with all that. I think, it was like the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict came down, and so many people were so happy for it. And so many people were so disappointed. And I think people, they take what they come away with it with, you take what you bring, and a lot of people are bringing a lot of stuff to it. And I think it's the same in a lot of parts of this country with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think there's a crossover between American propaganda, between Hollywood movies. My friend Tim used to talk about the
Feedback loop.
Yeah, the feedback loop. The rebels in the jungles of West Africa watching Rambo movies. To kind of get the kids, the child soldiers ramped up, and then the child soldiers were going out and fighting these wars, and then Hollywood was making movies about what the child soldiers were doing. It was really, really a fascinating feedback loop. But we don't have enough time to dig into all that. But
Yeah. But I mean, the way Tim talked about that stuff was really influential for me, and just being able to see what's really happening.
Right. Yeah.
And in video games too. I mean, I had a big video game company approach me recently asking me to, talk about how realistic their video game was.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was
But
just like, are you fucking kidding me?
So they found somebody else to do it, Peter.
I know they found someone else to do it. I knew they would, but
Yeah.
honestly, and I was sorry to see it because I liked the people that agreed to it, and maybe they badly needed the money or whatever. But damn, their integrity was at stake there a little bit too. I mean,
Yeah.
But I was almost offended that I was even approached. I was like, you looked at my photography and you wanted me to talk about how glorious war is in your video game. I'm almost insulted. And now I'm a little disappointed that obviously my pictures had so little impact, that you saw something in my pictures that has nothing to do with what was intended by them.
Right. But, at least regarding young men, I'm from an older generation, but, my grandfather fought in the First World War and my father fought in the Second World War. And I was expected to some degree, to go to war. And I think for a lot of young American men, that holds true today, regardless of the specifics of the war on terror.
That's why I was there, and that's why Ben was there too, right? I mean, that was part of it.
Yeah.
Some bullshit
I was
macabre
22.
dance with masculinity.
I'll leave it there, gentlemen.
Yeah, there we go. Hey, happy Friday, everybody, or Saturday, or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's Saturday.
Go have a drink.
Yeah, thank you so much. Seriously, we've got this exhibition up here at the Bronx Documentary Center. There's about, I'd say there's hundreds of photos, 15 photographers, tremendous amount of work. There's oral history, there's books, there's all kinds of stuff here. Check our website for hours, bronxdoc.org. And again, some of the best books to come out of Afghanistan, if you really want context for the war and understanding, Attention Service Member, Disco Night 9/11, Buzzing at the Sill, Sorry for the War. So, check out the books that these guys have done. There's some great work.
Look at this. I see Gene's on the panel. You should have brought him into the conversation.
All right.
Hey, Gene.
Gene Richards.
Joseph Rushmore. Yeah.
Joseph Rushmore. Yeah.
Hey, I see you, Mark Merman. Mikola Arazi, I just met.
Yeah, we should have just made it a group conversation.
Yeah. Vincent Albon, keep an eye out for this guy. He's like an undergrad right now. Great photographer.
Great. Love to meet him. Yeah. Please, folks, reach out to the Bronx Documentary Center, and I hope we all keep in touch as a community and try to keep doing the right thing here. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.